Richard Whitfield had attended 30 years of company galas, and he had disliked every single one of them. He sat at the head table in his charcoal suit, nodding when people spoke to him, shaking hands when hands were extended, and smiling just enough to satisfy the room. The ballroom of Whitfield Holdings looked impressive tonight. Round tables dressed in white linen, soft lighting bouncing off the polished floors, a grand piano gleaming in the corner near the stage. Grace had done a wonderful job organizing everything. He had told her so twice already, and he meant it both times. But Richard was not at peace. He rarely was at events like this, where the company's history was celebrated loudly, and the harder parts of that history were quietly left out. 30 years. People kept saying it like it was a triumph, and in many ways it was. But Richard knew what the 30th anniversary also meant. It meant 30 years since the worst decision he had ever made as a businessman, the restructuring of Whitfield's manufacturing subsidiary, which had put 43 employees out of work in a single week. He had been 40 years old, the company was hemorrhaging money, and his advisors had told him there was no other way. He had believed them. He had signed the papers. He still remembered the list of names. Michael Cho had been near the top. A quietly brilliant engineer in his early 30s, well-liked by his team, always the first one in and the last one out. Richard had personally admired him. He had even pulled him aside before the announcement and told him he was sorry, that it wasn't about his performance, that he hoped things would work out. Michael had nodded and said, "I understand, sir." That was the last time Richard had ever spoken to him. He had never found out what happened to Michael afterward. He had told himself, over the years, that no news was good news, that Michael had surely landed on his feet somewhere. But the thought had a way of returning on quiet nights, uninvited, refusing to be reasoned away. "Dad," Grace appeared at his elbow, wearing a green dress and a concerned expression. "You're doing that thing where you stare at nothing." "I'm listening," he said. "You're not. The pianist just canceled. He's sick, apparently. Fever." She kept her voice low, though the room was noisy enough that no one near them was paying attention. "I'm going to make a light announcement and see if anyone in the room plays. It'll seem spontaneous. People enjoy that." Richard looked at the grand piano in the corner. "Fine." Grace stepped up to the microphone near the stage and tapped it gently. The room settled. "Good evening, everyone," she said warmly. "We have a small change to tonight's program. Our pianist for the evening is feeling under the weather, so if there is anyone in the room who plays, please feel free to step up. Consider it an open invitation." She smiled and held up her glass. "To 30 years." The room echoed the toast, glasses lifted, and conversations resumed. For a long moment, no one moved toward the piano. Then Richard noticed something from the corner of his eye. Near the main doors, where he always stood during events, never sitting, never drawing attention to himself, Daniel Cho set down his chauffeur's cap on an empty chair. He straightened his jacket, and he walked, slowly and without hesitation, to the piano in the corner of the room. Richard put down his glass. Daniel was 45, a quiet man, with careful eyes and a calm manner that Richard had always appreciated. He had been Richard's driver for 6 years. In that time, they had exchanged perhaps a few hundred conversations, directions, schedules, the occasional comment about weather or traffic. Richard knew that Daniel was punctual, dependable, and private. He knew very little else about him. He watched Daniel sit down on the piano bench, adjust it slightly, and place his hands on the keys. The first notes fell into the room, like something dropped from a great height. Soft at first, then building, a melody that was precise and deeply felt at the same time. Conversations trailed off one by one. Glasses were set down. People turned. Within 30 seconds, the entire ballroom was listening. Daniel played as though there was no one else in the room. Richard felt the blood leave his face before he understood why. The melody was doing something to him that he could not immediately explain. It moved in a way that felt less like a song he was hearing and more like a memory he was being handed. His hands tightened in his lap. He had heard this piece before. It took him several bars to find it, dragged up from somewhere deep and dusty in his memory, but then it arrived all at once, and when it did, he had to breathe carefully to keep himself steady. He had heard this piece at a company dinner, decades ago. A younger dinner, a smaller room, a borrowed keyboard in the corner. And Michael Cho, in his early 30s, sitting down at the end of the night and playing something he had written himself, saying it wasn't finished yet, but he hoped it wasn't too bad. The room had applauded. Richard had told him it was beautiful, and he had meant it. This was that piece. He was certain of it. Grace appeared beside him again, having drifted back from the stage. She was watching Daniel play with an expression of quiet amazement. Then she looked at her father, and the amazement shifted to something closer to worry. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Nothing," he said, though his voice came out thinner than he intended. She followed his gaze to Daniel, then looked back at him. "Do you know that piece?" "I'm not sure," he said, which was not quite true. She slipped away and found Mr. Andrews near the drinks table, the company's HR director, white-haired now, one of the only people at Whitfield Holdings who remembered the early years with any real clarity. Richard watched them speak. He watched Andrews's expression change. The older man looked over at the piano, then at Richard, and then he said something more to Grace that made her go very still. Daniel finished the piece. The applause was immediate and genuine. Not polite applause, but the kind that meant the room had been genuinely moved. People were shaking their heads at each other in pleasant disbelief. Daniel stood, gave a modest nod, and stepped away from the piano, as quietly as he had approached it. Richard was on his feet before he had made any conscious decision to stand. He crossed the room, and people moved aside naturally, assuming the chairman had somewhere important to be. He found Daniel near the side wall, accepting a glass of water from a passing server. "Daniel," he said. Daniel turned. His expression was composed, the way it always was. "Mr. Whitfield, where did you learn that piece?" Daniel considered the question without apparent discomfort. "My father taught it to me," he said. "He composed it himself. I have been playing it since I was a boy." Richard felt the room tilt slightly. "Your father composed it?" "Yes, sir." "What was your father's name?" "Michael," Daniel said. "Michael Cho." Richard stood very still. Around them, the gala continued. Music from a speaker now, gentle and unobtrusive, filling the space that Daniel's playing had left behind. Somewhere across the room, someone laughed at something. Glasses clinked. The evening went on completely normally, indifferent to the fact that the world had just rearranged itself for Richard Whitfield. "He worked in engineering," Richard said. "It wasn't quite a question." "He did," Daniel said, "for a company called Whitfield Holdings, for about 4 years. He lost the position when he was 32. He found other work eventually, but nothing in his field. He passed away when I was 26. Richard could not speak for a moment. He looked at Daniel, really looked at him, the way he realized he had never fully done in 6 years, and saw things he should perhaps have seen before. The careful quality of his attention, the patience, the way he carried himself with a kind of quiet, self-contained dignity that Richard had always attributed to simple professionalism. 6 years, Richard finally said. "You have been driving me for 6 years." "Yes, sir, and you never said anything." Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in it became more direct. "I needed the job," he said. "And you were a fair employer. I had no reason to bring it up." "You had every reason," Richard said. "What I did to your father was a business decision during a difficult time," Daniel said. "I'm not saying it didn't have consequences. It did. It changed our family's life significantly." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But my father didn't blame you personally. He told me that before he died. He said hard decisions are made by people trying to keep other things standing, and that he understood, even if it hurt." Richard's jaw tightened. He had spent 30 years imagining this conversation, or a version of it, and he had always imagined himself defending his choices, explaining the financial pressures, making the case for why he'd had no option. He had not imagined that Michael Cho's son would already be holding the door open for him. "That is more grace than I deserve," Richard said. "I'm just telling you what he said." Daniel glanced down at his glass. He kept composing music until the end. He left behind 2 notebooks of pieces. That one was his favorite. Richard thought about Michael Cho, young, gifted, walking out of the Whitfield building with a box of belongings and nothing else, going home to a family that included a small boy who apparently learned his unfinished music by heart and carried it forward for over 40 years. The image was almost too much to hold. I owe you an apology, Richard said. And I owed your father one that I never had the chance to give. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Richard said. I want to. I should have spent more effort finding out what happened to the people we let go. I told myself it was too late, that there was nothing to be done. That was easier than admitting I simply didn't want to face it. He looked at Daniel steadily. I'm sorry, for what it's worth. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, a simple, unhurried nod, the kind that meant the words had been received and acknowledged without ceremony. It's worth something, Daniel said. Grace appeared beside her father, and Richard could tell from her face that she had spoken with Andrews and understood the situation. She looked between the two men and had the good sense not to fill the silence with anything unnecessary. Daniel, she said after a moment, Mr. Andrews mentioned that you studied engineering before you came to us. 2.5 years of a degree, Daniel said. I had to stop when my father got sick. I've continued learning on my own since then. He said it plainly, without embarrassment or self-pity. We have an opening in our manufacturing development team, Grace said. It's an entry-level position, with room to grow quickly for the right person. I'd like you to apply. She held up her hand slightly. Not as a favor. Andrews reviewed your background when we spoke just now, and he believes you're qualified. You'd go through the same process as anyone else. Daniel looked at her. Then he looked at Richard. I would consider that, he said slowly. Yes. The rest of the evening passed in the way that galas do, gradually, and then all at once, with coats being collected and handshakes exchanged at the door, and the cleaning staff beginning to fold tablecloths at the edges of the room. Richard stayed until nearly the end, which was unusual for him. He wasn't sure why, except that he felt less inclined than normal to leave quickly. As the last guests were departing, he walked over to the piano and stood beside it for a moment. He rested one hand on its surface, the dark, polished wood cool under his palm, and tried to remember what Michael Cho had looked like sitting at a keyboard 30 years ago. The memory was incomplete, softened by time, but it was there. He was glad it was there. 3 months later, Richard arrived at Whitfield Holdings at 8 in the morning, as he always did. His new driver, a young woman named Priya, was competent and punctual, and Richard had no complaints. But the mornings felt slightly different now, quieter, in a way he was still adjusting to. He took the elevator to his office on the top floor, went through his messages, and had his first coffee at his desk while reading the overnight reports. Midway through the morning, he passed through the second floor on his way to a meeting and glanced through the glass panels of the engineering division's workspace. Daniel was at a desk near the window, head down over a technical drawing, a cup of coffee going cold beside him in a way that suggested he had forgotten it was there. He worked with the same focused calm that had always defined him, as though the particular chair he was sitting in was simply the right one for the task at hand. Richard didn't stop. He had a meeting to get to, and Daniel had work to do, and neither of those things required interruption, but he slowed his pace for just a moment as he passed the glass, and something in his chest settled into a position it had not quite found in 30 years. That evening, the small quarterly gathering that Grace organized for senior staff included, as it often did, time around the piano in the conference lounge. Someone had once joked that Whitfield Holdings held more informal concerts than most companies held board meetings. Daniel came. He sat at the piano near the end of the night, when the conversation had grown comfortable and the room was relaxed, and he played his father's piece again, all the way through, without hurrying any part of it. Richard sat in a chair near the window and listened. He didn't say anything when it was over. He didn't need to. He simply listened, and was still, and let the music be what it was, a man's life's work, carried forward by the son who had loved him, filling a room that owed it something. That, Richard thought, was enough. It was not everything, and it was not a clean ending, but it was enough. And sometimes, he had come to understand, enough was the best that honest people could honestly offer.